Hi, my name is Amran Zaman, and this is Al Monitor's On the Middle East podcast. Today, I'll be discussing the role of a surprising new actor in the Iran conflict, Ukraine. Ukraine has been at war with Russia since 2022, and Iran has been supplying Russia with thousands of low-cost drones to fight Ukraine. Iran is now using its drones to considerable effect against the United States, Israel, and their Gulf allies. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, as the old adage goes, and Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy offered his military's expertise in countering Iranian drones to the leaders of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates during a tour of the region that ended on Sunday. Zelenskyy's last stop was Syria, whose President Ahmed al-Shara spent long years under attack from Iranian forces. With us here to discuss the emerging alliance between Ukraine and Iran's regional adversaries is Yevgeniya Gaber, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council who specializes on Turkey and Black Sea security. Welcome to our program, Yevgeniya.
Thank you for having me, Amber.
So we've been experiencing some really extraordinary developments over the past few days, obviously the biggest being the ceasefire between Iran and the United States. But we've also seen President Volodymyr Zelenskyy do a tour of the Gulf countries, and rather than being the supplicant, seeking help, President Zelenskyy has been offering help, notably his country's expertise in countering Iranian drones. Can you tell us a little bit more about all of this?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a fascinating turn that we're seeing right now, not only in the image of Ukraine turning from a constant black hole, only requiring some help and assistance, and always being this never-ending problem maker, troublemaker for everyone who just wants some money to get. Turning from this assistance recipient to actually security provider, being the only country who has combat tested solutions, anti-drone solutions, and new technologies. And when it comes especially to the Iranian drones, obviously there is no other country that can offer so much in terms of experience, in terms of electronic warfare, in terms of intercepted drones, training operators, and sharing all the solutions that it has developed over time, because we've been hit by the Iranian Shahed drones and also Iranian type Giran drones, Russian drones, by hundreds of thousands over these 4 years, and now the interception rate is about 85%, which is a very impressive number. Even more importantly, these are the drones that are being targeted by Ukrainian cheap interceptor drone that can be produced at mass instead of these legacy systems, super expensive, which we now see are in huge demand for the Middle East, for Ukraine, for other theaters and areas like Patriot missiles, for example. So while on the one hand, Ukraine is concerned about the quick running out of those air defense missiles like PAC-2, PAC-3, the Patriot ones, we can offer our own solutions. And I think this is one of the important characteristics of this visit, when Ukraine can offer something, can bring something to the table. And very often it's not short term, it's more of a, laying foundations for the long-term cooperation with the Gulf investments, Gulf money, and Ukrainian production lines, Ukrainian technology. There is a long, long way to take together.
Well, of course, I mean, nobody should grow complacent just because we have this ceasefire in place. And I think now more than ever, there'll be demand precisely to equip oneself with all of these Ukrainian systems in the expectation that perhaps the conflict could resume at any given time. So President Zelenskyy, of course, was also in Syria. And I assume it was for the same reason? Could you tell us a bit more about his trip to Damascus? Because he was in Qatar, he was in Saudi Arabia, he was in the UAE, but he also traveled to Syria, and before that was in Turkey. Was that also about drone technology?
Uh, well, absolutely. It was about the defense cooperation, the growing cooperation between Ukraine and the regional countries, the Gulf states, but also with the broader geography. But I would say it signals much more indicative and long-term consequences and long-term processes in the region. One of which is Ukraine emerging as a factor of regional security with its agency in the regional politics. Normally, unfortunately, especially before 2022, Ukraine had not been perceived as an independent player in the region. One of the problems that we have faced is that we have been perceived until recently as either a puppet in the hands of the United States or a part of the collective West. Now, I think I would say for the first time ever, Ukraine is seen as an equal partner, and all the contacts with Qatar, with Saudi Arabia, with the United Arab Emirates have showed that Ukraine has its own agenda with these countries, be it 10 years long security agreements, including drones, but not only drones. There are many different pieces into it, but also changing the equation for the region, showing how the influence of Russia is waning and how Ukraine is stepping in. And in case of Syria, just imagine President Zelenskyy of Ukraine, a country at war, visiting in person the capital of Syria, a very close ally of the Kremlin until recently. That would have been unthinkable a couple of years ago, and now we can see all of these high-level contacts. And this very clearly shows how Ukraine is trying to open up new opportunities in the region and also to create new contacts, to build new bridges with the region, and also turn its wartime experience into specific leverages in its regional diplomacy. So, given the Russian presence in Syria, Russian military bases, Russian or Soviet legacy systems in the country, I think it's really important to make sure that Ukraine reopens its embassy in Syria. Let's remember that our foreign minister was the second one after Hakan Fidan, the foreign minister of Turkey, who visited Syria after the fall of the Assad regime. And that's a continuation of these diplomatic efforts to build bridges with the new Syrian government. But of course, there is much more to it. There is agriculture, grain exports, food, energy supplies, and new roads and pipelines. Now there are all these discussions about potentially, regional new energy transport corridors, including Qatar, Syria, Turkey, etc. So that's what Ukraine is interested in, and of course, Ukraine has a lot to offer to Syria. And third point here, which I think is really important, is how it happened as a follow-up to President Zelenskyy's visit to Turkey and basically building a triangle, including Syria, Turkey, and Ukraine, and including Syria into the Ukrainian-Turkish dialogue and track, which is a win-win situation. It's beneficial for Ukraine because we don't need to build those connections from scratch. We don't need to be part of the kind of internal discussions, divisions, and regional problematic relations of different countries, but also benefiting from the strategic partnership between Kyiv and Ankara. We can expand our own regional cloud and also offer some help. And it's also good for Turkey and for Syria because that's where actually Ukraine can tap in with its own expertise and experience in defense and security.
Well, to the casual observer, though, it seemed rather odd to see President Zelensky have Hakan Fidan, the foreign minister of Turkey, in the same room as he was meeting with Ahmed al-Shara, the Syrian president. And likewise, again, Fidan was in the room when your foreign minister was meeting with a Syria's foreign minister. And one can't help but ask, is that also partly because Turkey wants to be in a position to monitor that relationship at some level, that it may not be entirely comfortable with that relationship because unlike the Gulf countries, I think the particular case of Syria poses challenges to Turkey in that it also faces quite a bit of hostility from Israel over its presence and influence over that country. And this is something that the Syrian president is having to balance. So, would you have anything to say about that beyond what you were calling the win-win situation? Isn't there also an element of perhaps distrust on the part of Turkey that it would feel compelled to be something of a nanny to President
Right.
Zelensky?
Well, I think definitely Syria is very sensitive for Turkey and everything that's happening in the region, very close to Turkish borders, are sensitive matters when it comes to a broader regional security setting, to include Israel that you've mentioned, to include the Kurdish factor, to include all the terror threats. There, obviously, Turkey wants to know what's happening and to be able to have a say in those processes. But in this specific case, I think it's a rather, complementarity than mistrust or distrust. Because for Ukraine, it's important to make sure that we have a stable region. It's important to get Syria recognize the territorial integrity of Ukraine, unlike the Assad regime, right? An ally of the Kremlin who was willing to recognize the so-called Donetsk and Lugansk republics or whatever. So all of these things are something that Ukraine would like to see, and Turkey would support this and would also have, some kind of a successful outcome of these negotiations if this happens. So I don't really see where there is a competition between Ukraine and Turkey, or where there is a rivalry between Ukraine and Turkey in Syria or in the region. So I'm quite optimistic, seeing rather how Ukraine is trying to use the already well-established Turkish diplomatic channels in Syria to build this new connection, rather than trying to, keep a foot in the door and monitor and control that Ukraine doesn't agree on something that would be unacceptable for Turkey. So in this case, I'm not a big conspiracy fan, so I'm quite optimistic.
Well, in the Middle East, we love conspiracy theories, so I had to touch upon this. But
Absolutely.
obviously, there's a lot of balancing going on. Shara has to balance his relations with Russia. I mean, he went twice to Russia since coming to power, which is quite extraordinary considering they were fighting during the Assad regime. And Turkey,
And
too, obviously has to keep relations sort of on an even keel with Vladimir Putin. One final question. Obviously, we kicked off saying how now Ukraine has positioned itself as this critical supplier of know-how that's so important for the defenses of these countries. But equally, of course, the war has benefited Russia with the rise in oil prices. Is that not concerning as well?
Oh, yes, it's a major concern for Ukraine because the only source of constant revenues for the Russian budget is oil and gas. And just with the spiking prices on oil after the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, and also wavering of some sanctions by the US on Russian oil and gas sector, Ukraine's main concern is that Russia will be able again to refuel its war machine and to use all this money it gets from the oil and gas trade to build new drones, new systems to attack Ukrainian civilians, alike with the Ukrainian military, and actually support Iran and other hostile regimes as well. If you look at the numbers, only in April, Russia has been able to basically double the revenues from oil and gas trade so far. With the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, of course, we expect the stabilization of the markets, and Ukraine is also trying to impose its own sanctions on Russia, meaning drone attacks and targeting Russia energy infrastructure, oil refineries, by now taking out almost 40% of Russian oil export capabilities. And that's, as far as I can see, that will continue in the future. So bringing this war to the end was very important for Ukraine, and now hopefully with kind of stabilization of the situation and reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, we hope that the prices will be balanced again, will go down again. But again, the policy of Ukraine is very pragmatic. There is no expectation that there will be an ideal situation for Ukraine. All regional actors are balancing, just as you've mentioned, Syria, Turkey, others. So for Ukraine, it's important to be part of this balance and to be able to shape this balance to our benefit.
Yevgeniya, thank you so much for all your insights.
Thank you, Amberine.
Well, this brings us to the end of this week's episode of On the Middle East. For more in-depth coverage of the Iran conflict and the rest of the region, please go to www.al-monitor.com. Thank you and goodbye.